How's it going, everyone? It's Avi from Weather Sponge 5000, and today we're going to forecast the amount of wind shear you should expect this 2022 hurricane season. But before I begin, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather-related content. Make sure to like if you like this video. Make sure to turn on post notifications if you want to see even more weather-related content. So to begin, the reason why we want to focus on how much wind shear we should expect this hurricane season is because that plays a big role in the amount of tropical cyclones that develop or strengthen a lot more because of course when there's strong wind shear, it's easy for tropical cyclones to weaken or see low pressure systems not even develop under hostile conditions such as strong wind shear. So it's very important to determine how much wind shear there will be to really determine the amount of tropical cyclones you should expect this hurricane season. So to begin, let's take a look at the wind shear right now. And of course, we're right around late March at this point. So of course, the wind shear is very strong throughout the Atlantic. There's really no area right now in the Atlantic that has conditions favorable for tropical cyclone development outside of maybe this small area just south of Cuba, but there isn't any low pressure systems, of course, to really develop into a tropical cyclone. And the area where the wind shear, the light wind shear is very small, and any low pressure system won't have much time to develop if there were a low pressure system in this area. So as a result, most of the Atlantic is under very hostile conditions when it comes to tropical cyclone development, because the wind shear is just strong by the amount of instability there is all throughout the northern hemisphere at this point. Of course, since warm air isn't yet dominating the entire Atlantic, but that will quickly change as we head into the summer. Now, taking a look at the Enzo Outlook, which is another huge determinant in determining how much wind shear there will be in the Atlantic, and you see that we're expected chance of a La Nina is very high over the next few months, pretty much for most of the spring months. However, if we were to head further and further into the year, you see the forecast does become a little bit more uncertain because there's an equal chance of a La Nina and an equal chance of a neutral phase dominating during the summer months. And that could definitely make a pretty big change when it comes to the wind shear. While a neutral phase and a La Nina phase aren't extremely different, especially since if we were to be in the neutral phase, it will likely be just barely in the neutral phase, more leaning towards a La Nina. It's definitely different because a La Nina typically brings wind shear that's much lighter than a neutral phase, because with a neutral phase, you're more likely to see a little bit more more atmospheric stability, and as a result, less hurricane and tropical cyclone development as a result of stronger wind shear and less more atmospheric stability. So if I were to show you, but you see that there's still an equal chance of a La Nina dominating this summer. So, and since a neutral phase is sort of expected to lean more towards a La Nina phase, because I don't expect it to come close to an El Nino phase this summer, I expect more La Nina type conditions when it comes to the wind shear in the Atlantic. If I were to show you guys what typically happens during a La Nina influence, you see that there's stronger vertical wind shear in the Eastern Pacific, but less vertical wind shear in the Atlantic as a result of a very cool and stable environment located in the Eastern Equatorial Pacific, where there isn't a lot of low pressure systems developing that would bring higher levels of wind shear in the upper levels of the atmosphere in the Atlantic. Because if there was area where the air is rising and there's a lot of low pressure systems, of course that air needs to sink somewhere, and it can't sink in this region because the air would be rising during a El Nino phase, or if the sea surface temperatures of the Eastern Equatorial Pacific were warmer than average. So as a result, a lot of the air aloft tends to move into the Atlantic during an El Nino phase, and that process creates stronger upper level winds, which makes it conditions more hostile for tropical cyclone development during an El Nino phase. That's not the case with the La Nina, because with the La Nina, we're seeing all the sinking air going on in this region and all the rising air happening in the Atlantic. So as a result, there isn't a large area of air molecules trying to move into the Atlantic. Rather, we're gonna see a lot of the air molecules aloft in the atmosphere attempt to move into the equatorial Pacific, where there's a strong sinking motion in the atmosphere. So as a result, there's much less wind shear during a La Nina. So based on the fact that we're sort of more likely to lean towards a La Nina phase, I expect that the wind shear will be lighter than average this Atlantic hurricane season, but there are other factors we need to take a look at as well. So another factor that's very obscure that not a lot of meteorologists talk about is that typically if there's a strong monsoon along the western African coast, or if there's more precipitation than average, it has been correlated that typically if there's more precipitation than average along the western African coast, you're more likely to experience less wind shear in the main development region. To show you guys a little bit of a comparison, take a look at the wind shear in map A, and then in map B, and take a look at it in map A. And the difference is that in map A, there's less precipitation than usual around the African coast, and as a result, we see stronger levels of wind shear in the upper levels of the atmosphere, where the winds are moving from a westerly direction rather than easterly direction. But during a strong monsoon season, or a season where there's a lot of precipitation along the African coast, we see the opposite occur, where the winds are primarily coming from an easterly direction, which promotes less wind shear and more tropical cyclone development. So it's very important to take a look at how much precipitation is forecast around Africa to determine how strong the wind shear will be in the main development region, the area that's most synonymous with tropical cyclone development. So if we were to take a look at that, here's a look at the precipitation forecast for the month of September, and it's very concerning because you see that most of the African coasts, or most of the area south of the Saharan desert, is experiencing conditions much more moist than average, which would show that there's more likely of a chance that there's going to be a stronger monsoon season for Africa, which would promote less wind shear than average throughout the main development region. And even if I were to move into August, you see the precipitation still remains. There's still certainly uncertainty regarding this forecast, because of course if you only go several miles to the south, you see that it's much drier than average. So there is maybe that possibility that over the next several months, the CFS computer model shifts its forecast to bring the drier air further northward, which would inhibit tropical cyclone development and inhibit the amount of wind shear in the atmosphere right around the main development region. However, at this point, it seems like the CFS model wants to bring a much more moist than average year for a lot of Africa, which would mean that there's a stronger monsoon and there will be less wind shear than average, it shouldn't inhibit tropical cyclone development, which would allow for more tropical cyclones to develop around the main development region. And even if we were to take a look at the wind shear throughout the North Atlantic in general, the current forecast is that the wind shear will be much lighter than average, which would promote more tropical cyclones than average this hurricane season. So if I were to show you guys a 3-month average, let's take a look between the months of July, August, and September, you see that there's a clear correlation between the precipitation right around Africa as well as the lighter than average wind shear. When there's more precipitation, there's a little bit less vertical wind shear in the main development region, and we see it all throughout the Atlantic. This includes the Caribbean. This includes much of the main development region, especially closer along the African coast. So only areas where wind shear might be closer than average or maybe slightly above average is right around the southeast, which definitely would be maybe the best case scenario for the southeast, because maybe that could inhibit tropical cyclones from really developing at a very rapid pace like we saw in previous hurricane seasons. For example, one that comes to mind is Hurricane Ida, of course, which made landfall in Louisiana last in very late August. And of course, Hurricane Michael rapidly intensified before reaching the coast. So if there is a little bit of stronger vertical wind shear than average, and that should inhibit the rapid intensification of tropical cyclones moving in and around the southeast coast. But you see that there really isn't a strong representation that there will be much stronger than average wind shear. And of course, it's bound to change, but I think with the area of lighter than average wind shear this large, and we're only less than 6 months away from, let's say, July and August, I think we should definitely be aware that most likely we'll see less wind shear than average throughout the Atlantic. So that's something to keep in mind, that I do expect more tropical cyclones than average as a result of lighter than average wind shear. So another thing we need to take a look at is the Arctic Oscillation. So pretty much, to make a long story short, during a negative Arctic Oscillation, we typically see more jet stream dips than average, which would mean that there would be more wind shear than average as a result of troughs digging down further southward, and it could inhibit some tropical cyclone development. And we'll see upper level lows become a derivative of some of these jet stream dips, which of course do also limit tropical cyclone development. However, during a positive Arctic Oscillation, we typically see less jet stream dips, and as a result, there's less vertical wind shear and a more favorable environment for tropical cyclone development. And as you can see right now, we're in a negative phase, and of course, since we're in late March at this point, there isn't going to be any sort of tropical cyclones anytime soon. But it's definitely important to keep in mind how the Arctic Oscillation will move over the next several months, I meant to say. And you see that ever since early January, we primarily been in a positive phase. It's very difficult to forecast the Arctic Oscillation because, as you can see based on this graph, you see that it varies. There's a large variation with where the line ends up. But what I do notice is that typically when you're either in a positive Arctic Oscillation or a negative Arctic Oscillation, for the most part, it lasts for several months, because you see that ever since early January, we still primarily mostly been in a positive Arctic Oscillation, and now we're dipping down back into the negatives, which lasted for 2 months. So based on this fact that we're gonna enter a negative phase over the next few months, we could rebound back to a positive Arctic Oscillation right around the beginning of the hurricane season, assuming that this negative Arctic Oscillation lasts for maybe another 1 to 3 months. So that would definitely be the worst case scenario, but again, very difficult to forecast. Take this with a grain of salt, but it's definitely something to keep in mind once this hurricane season comes around, because it does definitely have a major effect when it comes to vertical wind shear in the Atlantic. So now let me show you guys my forecast when it comes to wind shear. So throughout the main development region, I'm expecting very weak wind shear for the most part. In the lighter green, I expect it to be much weaker. In the darker green, I expect it to be weak, but not as weak as, let's say, if you were in the lighter green area. And the only area where you possibly could experience maybe moderate wind shear is right around southeast, which will definitely be sort of the better case scenario for the United States, because that could slow down hurricane development as it moves closer and closer to the U.S., and of course would inhibit tropical cyclones from forming near the United States coast. But I'd still lean more towards maybe an average sort of wind shear pattern for the United States. Not necessarily higher wind shear than usual, but not necessarily less wind shear than usual. So I still do expect a fair share of tropical cyclones to impact the United States in a strong way, especially since the tropical low pressure systems have this large area to where they could really strengthen and intensify, where the wind shear would be weaker than average. So that's something to keep in mind. But take this forecast with a grain of salt. This Of course, forecasting something long term is very difficult. So, but I'd say more likely than not, most of the Atlantic should experience much weaker than average wind shear. So I do expect more tropical cyclones than usual this hurricane season. As a result. So, anyways, guys, I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather-related content, and I hope you guys all have a great day.